The Republic of the Marshall Islands covers about 2 million square kilometres of the Central Pacific. Almost none of it is land. 29 atolls, 5 single islands, somewhere over 1,000 separate scraps of coral sand, most of them narrow enough to walk across in a minute. Add every one of them together and you get roughly 180 square kilometres. That is smaller than most cities. It is spread across a stretch of ocean the size of a continent. 98% of this country is water. On one of those atolls, the highest ground is not a hill, it is a disc of concrete, 45 centimetres thick, several hundred panels laid across a crater like scales. It rises about 3 metres above the sea, and on Enewetak Atoll, nothing natural rises higher. Both of those things are true at the same time. This is a nation of coral and open water, older than most of Europe's borders, and the tallest place anyone can stand on one of its atolls is a lid that was poured into a hole. 42,000 people live in this country. They did not build that dome. They were not asked about it. But it sits on their ground, in their lagoon, inside the same ring of reef their families have fished for 2,000 years. And the strange part is not the dome. The strange part is the ground underneath it. Because this land was never going to hold anything. Not water, not soil, not a shoreline, not a secret. So what exactly is this place made of? Start with what is missing. There is no river in the Marshall Islands. Not a small one, not a seasonal one, not anywhere. There is no stream, no lake on any atoll, no spring, no waterfall, no pond that fills after rain and drains away. In a country of 34 separate pieces of land, there is no surface freshwater of any kind. There is also no stone, no granite, no basalt outcrop, no cliff, no bedrock a person could quarry, nothing hard enough to cut a block from. There is no soil either, not in the sense a farmer would recognise it. What passes for ground here is coral sand and coral gravel, ground up by waves and shifted by storms. Rain runs straight through it, the way water runs through a sieve. And there is almost no height. Most of the country sits 2 to 3 metres above the sea. The single highest natural point in the entire republic is a patch of ground on Majuro Atoll that reaches about 3 metres, a rise so slight you would walk over it without noticing you had climbed. Now put those absences together. No rock, no soil, no rivers, no elevation. A landform made entirely of loose carbonate rubble sitting in the middle of the deepest ocean on Earth. The question the rest of this film answers is not why anyone would build a dome here. It is why anyone lives here at all, and what 42,000 people worked out about this ground that the dome builders did not. Because they did work it out, a long time ago. Majuro is the capital. It is not a city on an island. It is closer to a road with a country attached to it. The atoll runs 64 kilometres from end to end. For almost all of that distance, the land is under 300 metres wide. In the built-up part, it narrows to less than 100. Stand on the centre line of the main road and the open Pacific is often within 150 metres to your north. The lagoon is a similar distance to your south. In places, you can see both at once. 2 different colours of water on either side of a strip of ground you could cross on foot in 90 seconds. Dark navy on the ocean side, roughened by swell that has crossed thousands of kilometres of open sea. Pale turquoise on the lagoon side, shallow, still, lit from below by white sand. There is one road, 50 kilometres of it, running the length of the southern rim. There is no ring road, no second route, no alternative when the first is blocked. The road runs west until it reaches a village called Laura, loops around a paved turnaround, and comes back the way it came. That is the entire road network of a national capital. Around 28,000 people live along it. That is close to 2/3 of the country, on a ribbon of coral that is, in most places, thinner than a football pitch is long. The urban core sits between 1 and 2 meters above mean sea level. This is not an accident of planning. It is the shape the reef made. An atoll is a ring. Coral grows fastest where the water moves, on the outer rim, where ocean swell delivers food and oxygen. It grows slowly, or not at all, in the still water inside. So over thousands of years, the reef builds a circle. Waves break sand and rubble off the rim and pile it in ridges on top. Those ridges dry out, catch seeds, and become islands. The lagoon in the middle never fills. Maduro's is nearly 300 square kilometers of water with nothing in it. Which means every piece of habitable land in this country is, by definition, a narrow strip on the edge of a hole. The people did not choose to live in a line. The reef decided that. They live on the rim because the rim is the only part that came up out of the water. And a rim has a particular property. It has ocean on both sides. When a large swell arrives from a distant storm, and it does, from both the North and the South Pacific several times a year, it does not hit a coast and stop. There is no interior for it to run out of energy across. The wave crosses the reef flat, climbs the beach, and in the worst events, runs clean across the island and out the other side into the lagoon. Records from the last few decades count 18 separate inundation events on Majuro. Coral, rubble, sand, and debris pushed across the road. On some occasions, the water has come from the lagoon side instead. No wave at all, simply a high tide arriving during a season of high sea levels and rising over the shore of a place with nowhere higher to go. There is no high ground to move to. There is only the other side of the road. So when people ask why the Marshallese built no walls, no citadels, no terraces, no hill forts, the answer is in the sentence above. There is nothing to build them from, and nowhere to put them. What the land offered instead was a very small number of very good materials. Coral rock, coconut wood, pandanus leaf, breadfruit timber, and sennet, cord twisted from coconut husk fiber. Out of those 5 things came houses, mats, sails, rope, and the fastest ocean-going canoes anyone in the Pacific had built. The land gave them almost nothing, so they got very, very good at using the water. There is one animal here that has made the opposite bargain. The coconut crab is the largest land arthropod on Earth. A big one spans a meter from leg tip to leg tip and weighs 4 kilograms, and it can crack a coconut with its claw, a grip strong enough to be measured in the hundreds of newtons. It lives on the islands, on the sand, in burrows, under the litter of fallen fronds. And it cannot swim. The coconut crab begins life in the sea, as a larva drifting in open water. It comes ashore as a juvenile, borrowing an empty shell like a hermit crab. Then, as it grows, it does something no other land crab does. It abandons the shell entirely, hardens its own abdomen, and rebuilds its gills into a branchiostegal lung. The organ works in air. It does not work underwater. An adult coconut crab dropped into the sea will drown. So here is an animal that lives on islands 2 meters above the ocean, surrounded by the ocean, entirely unable to enter it. It has committed to land, on some of the least reliable land in the world. The female still has to go back. Once a year, she carries her eggs to the shoreline at high tide, releases them into the surf, and returns up the beach. The species is now gone from many of the inhabited atolls and holds on best in the places where nobody lives. The Marshallese made the other choice. They kept the sea. At the far western end of Majuro, 64 kilometers from the airport, the road ends at Laura. Laura is different from the rest of the atoll, and the difference is measured in meters. Here, the island is wide. Not wide by any normal standard, a few hundred meters across, but wide compared to the 100-meter threads that make up most of the rim. And it is high, by local reckoning, about 3 meters. That is the highest natural ground on the atoll, and among the highest in the country. Which is why Laura is the farm. The breadfruit here grows thicker, the pandanus stands taller, the coconut is denser. There are pigs and gardens and produce that gets driven the length of the road into town every week. And the reason is entirely subsurface. When rain falls on coral sand, it soaks straight down until it reaches the seawater, saturating the rock beneath. Fresh water is lighter than salt water, so it does not mix and disappear. It floats. It floats as a lens, thick in the middle, thinning to nothing at the edges, sitting on top of the sea inside the island itself. The shape is the giveaway. A lens can only be as thick as the island is wide. On a strip 100 meters across, the fresh water has nowhere to accumulate before it reaches the shoreline on either side, where the salt water pushes in. The lens is thin, brackish, and easily ruined. On a wider island, the lens has room to deepen. Under Laura, it reaches something like 8 to 14 meters of fresh water at the center, in an area of roughly 140 hectares. Width creates water. That is the whole rule. Every settlement pattern in this country descends from it. Where the reef happened to pile a little more sand, people could drink. Where it did not, they could visit but not stay. And it explains something else, why some of the most beautiful land in the Marshall Islands has nobody on it at all. The atolls run in 2 chains. Ratak in the east means sunrise. Ralik in the west means sunset. They lie roughly parallel, northwest to southeast, across about 1,000 kilometers of open ocean. 34 pieces of land. Roughly a quarter of them have no permanent population, and the ones that do are not evenly used. In the 2021 census, about 90% of the country lived on 6 atolls. 3 out of every 4 Marshallese were on just 2, Majuro and Kwajalein. The rest of the map is mostly gaps. Arno lies 20 kilometers east of Majuro. On a clear day at low tide, you can see it from the road. 133 islets, 13 square kilometers of land, and a lagoon of nearly 340. Eiling Laplap, in the Ralik chain, is called the greatest atoll. 56 islands, 14 square kilometers, and a lagoon of 750. The Marshallese say the oldest stories were made there. Jaluit, further south, holds 91 islands around a lagoon of 690 square kilometres. It was the administrative seat once. It is a protected wetland now. Look at those numbers again. Land measured in single figures. Water measured in hundreds. And between the atolls, nothing. No islands, no shoals, no landmarks. Hundreds of kilometres of open ocean where the horizon is a perfect circle. Now imagine crossing that in a canoe. The land here is too low to see. From the deck of a small boat, a Marshallese island disappears below the horizon at something like 10 to 15 kilometres, and the atolls are often 100 kilometres or more apart. For most of the voyage, there is no visual evidence that the destination exists. The navigators solved this by not looking. A remetto, a person of the sea, would lie down flat in the hull of the canoe, not to rest, to listen with his body. Ocean swell does not stop at an island, it bends around it. Part of the wave slows as it crosses shallow water and curves inward, wrapping the land. Part of it bounces back the way it came. On the far side, the two curving halves meet and interfere with one another, making a distinctive knot of chop that extends outward like a wake. That pattern reaches far beyond the point where the island itself becomes visible. The Marshallese identified 4 principal swells and named each one. Relib, the strongest, running from the northeast. Caleb, Bungdokerik, Bundokying. A trained navigator could feel all 4 at once through the hull, sort them apart, and read where they were being disturbed. And they built teaching objects for it, frames of coconut palm midrib lashed with fibre, with curved sticks representing bending swell and cowrie shells marking islands. There were 3 kinds. Matang, the small abstract trainer, showing how waves behave around a single piece of land. Meadow, covering a group of neighbouring atolls. Rebelib, covering an entire chain. They were never taken to sea. These were not charts in the sense of something you unfold and consult. They were memory devices, studied ashore until the pattern lived in the body. You learned the object, and then you left it behind and went out and felt the thing itself. The canoe underneath him was built for exactly this water, and it was unlike anything in Europe. The Marshallese Wallop has an asymmetric hull, flat on the side that faces the outrigger, curved on the side that faces away, which generates lift against the sideways push of the wind and lets the boat hold a course far closer to the wind than a symmetrical hull can. It does not tack by turning through the wind, it shunts. The sail is walked from one end of the hull to the other, and the bow becomes the stern. Which means the outrigger float never has to cross to the leeward side, where it would be pressed under and capsize the boat. On a craft designed to cross 100 kilometres of open swell, with no keel and no deck, that single decision is the difference between arriving and not. Coconut wood, breadfruit timber, pandanus sail, senet lashing. 4 materials from 4 plants, and the result outran every ship that came looking for these islands for the next 300 years. The knowledge was held closely. It passed within families, to chosen descendants, and a navigator who gave it away carelessly gave away his standing with it. It is worth stopping on what this means. A people with no metal, no glass, no writing, and no elevation built a working model of wave refraction and interference. The same physics a modern oceanographer would recognise from sticks and shells, and used it to cross open ocean reliably enough to keep a nation of scattered specks connected for 2,000 years. They did it because the land had failed to be visible, so they read the water instead. And 2,000 years is the number that should stop you. Because this country is not old. The land is. The reef beneath it has been growing for tens of millions of years. But the islands on top, the dry parts, the parts a person can stand on, are recent. Sea level in the Central Pacific reached its post-glacial peak several thousand years ago and then settled slightly lower. As it dropped, the reef flats that had been just underwater came just above it. Sand began to pile and stay. Maduro's islands emerged from the sea somewhere around 2100 to 1900 years ago, and the archaeology says people arrived almost immediately afterwards. Around 2000 years ago, canoes come over the horizon. They are carrying breadfruit shoots, pandanus, taro corms, coconuts, chickens, and people. They have crossed open ocean from the southwest, from the direction of the Solomons and Vanuatu, along a chain of islands that runs out long before this one begins. They land on ground that has been above water for perhaps a century. There is no soil on it. There is nothing to eat that is not in the sea. They stay. That is the whole of the settlement story, and it is why this documentary is not a history film. The people did not arrive at an old country and change it. They arrived at a brand new one, made of sand, and adjusted themselves to it within a generation or two. They named the whole archipelago Ilon Cain Ad, our islands. Not a claim of ownership so much as a statement of relationship. These particular ones, out of all the water. Something else came ashore on that same sand, and it had been coming for far longer. The green turtle nests on coral beaches, and coral beaches are the only thing an atoll reliably produces. A female hauls out at night, above the high tide line, digs a chamber about half a metre deep with her rear flippers, and lays somewhere between 80 and 120 eggs. Then she covers it and goes back to the water. She does not return to the nest. The temperature of the sand decides the sex of everything inside it. Cooler nests produce mostly males. Warmer nests produce mostly females. The threshold sits within a degree or two. So on an island made of nothing but sand, the sand itself is the incubator, the thermostat, and the census. The largest nesting colony in the Marshall Islands is not on any of the populated atolls. It is on two remote rings in the far north where nobody lives at all. And the reason is simple. Turtles need beaches without dogs, without pigs, without rats, and without lights that draw hatchlings inland instead of towards the surf. Green turtles have been coming to these beaches longer than the beaches have existed. When this sand was still underwater, they were nesting somewhere else, on shores that are now gone. They will outlast most of what is built here. They have already outlasted a great deal. But a turtle does not need to drink. People do, and that is where this landform becomes genuinely difficult. Rain is the only fresh water this country receives. All of it. There is no other input. And the rain is not distributed evenly. It falls in a gradient across the archipelago, heavy in the southeast and thinning towards the northwest. Maduro averages around 3.5 meters of rainfall a year. Kwajalein in the middle, around 2.5. Eniwetok in the far northwest, around 1.5 meters. That gradient is the reason the northern atolls are empty and the southern ones are not. About 3/4 of the year's rain arrives between roughly June and December. The remaining months are the dry season, and in the dry season, the household tanks run down. Every roof in the Marshall Islands is a catchment. Gutted, piped, feeding a tank. That is not a quaint detail, it is primary national infrastructure. But roofs are small. So Majuro did something that has no real parallel anywhere else. It made a watershed out of an airport. The runway and taxiways at Majuro cover about 30 hectares of sealed tarmac. Rain that falls on them does not soak away, because tarmac is the one surface on the atoll that will not let water through. It is graded, collected, and piped into a line of reservoirs holding roughly 130 million litres. In an average year, that catchment yields around 700 million litres. It is the largest single source of fresh water in the Republic. The second source is the Laura lens, pumped from a scatter of wells at the wide western end, with a sustainable yield of something in the region of 400 million litres a year. Between them, they supply a capital city. Water is pumped to households for a set number of hours on set days of the week, not continuously, because there is not enough of it to run a tap around the clock. And the reservoirs hold, at full, about 30 to 50 days. In 1998, after several months in which barely an inch of rain fell, that ran out. Reverse osmosis units were flown in. Pumping from the Laura lens was pushed hard enough that, at the peak, groundwater was supplying up to 90% of the drinking water on the atoll, and hydrologists went out to measure how much of the lens was left. In 2013, it happened again, worse and further north. The wells on the northern atolls went dry. Breadfruit died. Pandanus died. Banana and coconut died. The lenses under the small islands turned saline as the fresh water was drawn down and the sea came in underneath. Around 11,000 people were affected, roughly a fifth of the population at the time. Families began leaving the outer atolls for the capital. Let that sit for a moment, because it is the central fact of this landform. The Marshall Islands sits in one of the wettest parts of the tropical Pacific. 3.5 meters of rain a year falls on the capital, more than 4 times what London receives. And the country can be a few dry months away from having nothing to drink. Not because the rain fails, because the ground will not keep it. Which is worth saying plainly, because everything that follows in this film depends on it. There is exactly one impermeable surface in the Marshall Islands. It is a runway. Somebody had to pave it. The same problem shapes what grows here. Coral sand is not soil. It is calcium carbonate, crushed skeleton essentially, with almost no nitrogen, no organic matter, no clay to hold moisture or nutrients. Rain passes through it in hours. Across all 34 pieces of land in this country, agriculture comes down to 4 plants.
Coconut, first and everywhere. Breadfruit, pandanus, and swamp taro.
That is the list. Not a shortened version of the list, the list. Each one is a solution to a specific failure of the ground. The coconut palm tolerates salt spray and can put roots down toward brackish water that would kill most crops. Pandanus grows on the bare beach ridge and holds it together, and its fruit and leaf give food, thatch, mats, and sailcloth from a single tree. Breadfruit is the calorie engine. A mature tree yields heavily for decades, and the fruit stores as a fermented paste in covered pits for years, which matters enormously on land where nothing can be granaried. But the strangest of the 4 is the taro. Swamp taro will not grow in dry coral sand. It needs standing fresh water. So the Marshallese went and found the fresh water where it actually was, down in the lens, and dug to meet it. They excavated pits several meters across, down through the coral rubble until the base sat in the top of the freshwater lens. Then they filled the pit over years with compost. Leaves, husks, fish waste, mulch, ash. generation after generation feeding the same hole. They were not planting a crop, they were manufacturing soil, by hand, in a country that had none, and then keeping it damp by putting it below the water table instead of above it. A breadfruit sapling gets the same treatment on a smaller scale. Dug in on a rainy day, into a hole a foot deep or more, packed with every kind of compost the household can spare. This is what constraint looks like when it is solved rather than complained about. The land offered no earth, so they made earth, one pit at a time, and passed the pit down. Now go northwest to Kwajalein. Kwajalein Atoll is enormous. 97 islands strung around a lagoon of more than 2,000 square kilometres, one of the largest atoll lagoons anywhere on the planet. The rim is a hairline. The water inside it is the size of a small country. And that lagoon is a shape worth understanding because it is a fossil. The ring of Kwajalein traces the outline of a volcano that no longer exists. Coral built the reef around the mountain's shoulders while it stood, and kept building upward as it sank, so the reef preserved the coastline of a landmass that has been gone for millions of years. The lagoon floor is the drowned summit. The rim is the old shoreline. The pass through the reef, where boats enter, is often where a river once ran off the volcano and kept the coral from closing over. Every atoll in this country is the same thing, an outline held in place by an organism long after the thing it outlined disappeared. The Marshallese live on the edge of 34 sunken mountains. There is not one of them left to see. And on one islet of that rim sits the most crowded ground in the Pacific. Ebi covers about 32 hectares, 80 acres, a rectangle you could walk end to end in 15 minutes. At the 2011 census, 9,614 people lived on it. That works out at over 80,000 people per square mile, a density that puts it alongside the densest urban districts on Earth, on an island with no high-rise, no hills, and no room to expand in any direction except upward or outward into the sea. Ebi was not always like this. Before the Second World War, it was a small fishing community. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the atoll's largest island was taken over for military use, Marshallese families living elsewhere in Kwajalein were moved off their islands and concentrated onto a planned settlement on Ebi. They came, and then more came, because the base was where the wages were, and there was nowhere else to go that had wages. The result is an island where more than half the population is under 18, where housing is stacked into every available meter, and where sewage outfalls sit close enough to the shore that the lagoon people fish in and the lagoon people flush into are the same body of water. The geography did not cause that, but the geography made it inescapable. Because when a country has 180 square kilometers of land, and a portion of that is uninhabitable through drought, and a portion is closed off, the remainder is not a policy question. It is arithmetic. There is no suburb to expand into. There is no next valley. Every square meter is already the edge of something. Ebi is what happens when people are subtracted from a place that has almost no places. Out in the lagoon, in water so clear it looks like nothing at all, another organism has solved the same shortage in the opposite direction. Atoll lagoons look extraordinary because they are empty. Clear water is nutrient-poor water, nothing suspended in it, because there is nothing suspended in it to eat. The giant clam took that as an instruction. Tridacna does not really feed the way a clam feeds, it farms. Inside the fleshy mantle that spills out over the shell live millions of single-celled algae, housed in a branching tube system that spreads them out toward the light. The clam gives them shelter and nitrogen. They photosynthesize and hand most of the sugar back. Iridescent cells in the mantle scatter and filter sunlight to keep the algae inside from burning at the surface and starving in the depths. It is a solar array wearing a shell. A meter across, hundreds of kilograms, sitting in one spot for a century, running on light because there was nothing else on offer. The remote northern atolls of this country hold the highest densities of giant clam in the central and western Pacific, along with the greatest reef fish biomass measured in the tropical Pacific. Which brings us to the emptiest places on the map, and to why they are empty. Bikar and Bokak sit at the far northern end of the Ratak chain. Bikar has half a square kilometre of land, 6 islets around a lagoon of 37 square kilometres. Bokak is comparably small. Together they are among the least land-endowed atolls in a country made of small ones. Nobody lives on either. And the reason is not remoteness, it is rain. Follow that rainfall gradient far enough northwest and it drops below what a lens can survive. Too little land to accumulate fresh water, too little rain to recharge what does accumulate. The lens under an islet that small would be a few brackish meters at best, and it would fail every dry season. People visited, people fished, people came for turtle and seabird and pandanus. But there was a line drawn across this archipelago by rainfall, and beyond it, nobody could stay. What that produced is a set of reefs that have been left almost entirely alone. Survey teams working these atolls recorded the highest coral cover in the central and western Pacific, mature Pisonia forest in good condition, the country's largest green turtle nesting colony, large seabird colonies, deep-sea sharks, spawning aggregations, and reef fish in numbers that no inhabited atoll can match. One of the scientists described diving there as looking at the ocean of 1,000 years ago. There is something worth sitting with in that. The parts of this country that could not support human life are now the parts holding the best of it. The northern atolls were not preserved by a decision. They were preserved by an absence of drinking water. In 2025, that accident was made deliberate. The waters around Bikar and Bokak, some 48,000 square kilometers, became the first national marine sanctuary in the Marshall Islands, closed to fishing entirely. An area larger than Switzerland, protecting 2 rings of sand with a combined land area smaller than a farm. The rest of the northern map has the same emptiness, for the same reasons and for others. Tokay and Bikar hold the smallest land areas in the Republic, a few tenths of a square kilometre apiece, visited from neighbouring atolls but never settled. Knox Atoll, at the southern end of Ratak, was once joined to Mili. A passage now separates them. The reef changed its mind about where the land should be. Ujilang, out west, held people once. It does not now. Ailuk, Wache, Maloelap, Uterik. 3 meters high, a few square kilometers of land each, lagoons of hundreds of square kilometers, populations in the low hundreds and falling. And Majit, east of the Ratak line, is the exception that measures everything else. Majit is not an atoll. It is a raised, stony island with a fringing reef and no true lagoon. And because it is solid, slightly elevated, it has something no atoll in this country has. A freshwater lake, with ducks on it. The people of Mahit call their island Paradise. 230 of them live there. It is lush with pandanus and breadfruit and taro, and it is famous for its mats. 1 island out of 34 gets a lake. That is the ratio this country lives at. Now go to the far northwest corner of the map, where the rain is thinnest. Enewetak Atoll is a ring of about 40 islands around a lagoon 40 kilometers long and 32 wide, dropping to around 64 meters at its deepest. It is the second westernmost atoll of the Rallick chain. Land elevation, like everywhere else here, runs 2 to 3 meters. Rainfall is the lowest in the country. People had lived on it for something close to 2,000 years. Between 1946 and 1958, 67 nuclear tests were carried out across the northern Marshall Islands. 43 of them were at Enewetak. The population had been moved off the atoll before the program began, resettled on Ujalang, which is smaller and drier and has less of everything. On the 1st of November 1952, a device was detonated on the islet of Elujalab, at the northern rim of the atoll. It was the first full-scale test of a thermonuclear design. The yield was around 10 megatons. Elujalab is not on the map anymore. Where the islet had been, there was a crater in the reef nearly 2 kilometers across and roughly 150 meters deep. An island that had existed for 2,000 years stopped existing in a morning. The reef rim it sat on was breached. Say the arithmetic out loud, because it is the only way to feel it. The total explosive yield detonated across this archipelago over 12 years has been described as equivalent to more than one Hiroshima-scale weapon every day for the entire period. That was released onto 180 square kilometers of coral sand, 2 to 3 meters above the Pacific Ocean. Fallout carried onto atolls where people were still living. Others were evacuated afterwards. Some atolls were never resettled. Some were resettled and then emptied again. The people of Enewetak spent 33 years on Ujalang. They asked to go home for most of them. There is no version of this that resolves. It should not. But this film is about the ground, and the ground is about to become the point. Because in the late 1970s, a decision was made to clean the atoll up so that the people who had been removed from it could return. And to clean it up, something had to be buried. Before that, one more animal, because it explains what they were burying it in. The bumphead parrotfish is the largest parrotfish in the world. 1.5 meters long, up to 70 kilograms, with a blunt forehead and a beak made of fused teeth. It eats coral. Not the algae on the coral itself, live in mouthfuls, biting chunks out of the reef and grinding them in a second set of teeth deep in the throat. The animal digests the tissue and passes the rest. What comes out is fine white carbonate sand. A single large adult processes something on the order of several tons of reef a year. A school working a reef flat produces sand continuously, in clouds, drifting down and settling. Which means the beach is not around the reef. The beach came out of the reef, through a fish. Stand on any island in this country, and the ground under your feet was, at some point, eaten. Ground by a beak, passed through a gut, dropped on a reef flat, moved by a wave, and piled by a storm into a ridge that dried out and grew a coconut palm. That is the substrate. Loose, biological, sorted by water and moved by water. And it goes down a very long way. Runit is a small island on the eastern rim of Enewetak Atoll. On the 5th of May 1958, an 18-kiloton device codenamed Cactus was detonated on its northern tip. It was a small test by the standards of what had already happened here. It left a crater about 115 meters across, punched down into the coral. 20 years later, that crater was still there. And in 1977, when the decision was taken to decontaminate the atoll, it became the obvious place to put things. Over 3 years, crews scraped contaminated topsoil, coral, vegetation, scrap metal and debris from across the atoll and trucked it to ruin it. Roughly 85,000 cubic meters of it, call it 111,000 cubic yards, mixed with cement and poured into the cactus crater. Then they capped it. Several hundred concrete panels, 45 centimeters thick, laid over the top in a shallow dome, about 115 meters wide. It was finished in 1980. The people of Enewetak came home the same year to the southern end of the atoll, about 20 kilometres from Runit. Runit itself was quarantined and remains so. And here is the detail that this entire film has been walking toward. The crater was never lined. The dome sits on top. Underneath it, there is no membrane, no clay, no impermeable base of any kind. The material was placed directly into a hole in the coral, and the hole was left open at the bottom, which means groundwater moves through it. Not as a leak in the ordinary sense, not a crack that opened later, but as the ordinary daily behaviour of an atoll. The tide rises, seawater pushes into the porous carbonate under the island, and the water table inside the rock rises with it. 6 hours later, it falls again. That happens under every island in this archipelago, twice a day, and it has happened for 2,000 years. The dome was built to hold something inside ground that has never held anything. And the thing is, that was already known. It had been proved on the same atoll, 6 years before Cactus. Go back to 1842. Charles Darwin publishes an explanation for atolls that nobody has been able to test. His argument is that a coral reef begins as a fringe around a volcanic island, and that as the volcano slowly subsides, the coral grows upward to stay in the sunlit shallows. Eventually, the volcano disappears entirely beneath the sea, and what is left is a ring of living reef around a lagoon of open water. If he is right, then underneath every atoll there is a very deep column of coral limestone, and at the very bottom of it, volcanic rock. He never visits the Marshall Islands. He never sees an atoll of this kind at all. And for over a century, nobody can drill deep enough to find out. The Royal Society tried, at Funafuti, 3 separate times in the 1890s. The last attempt reached about 340 metres and found more limestone. It proved nothing. Then, in 1951 and 1952, a geologist named Harry Ladd persuaded the American program operating at Enewetak to put deep boreholes into the atoll. The first hole reached 390 metres, still limestone. The next 2 went far deeper, one to 1,411 metres, the other to 1,287. And both of them struck basalt. Volcanic rock at the bottom of a column of coral limestone roughly 1,400 metres thick. The core came up full of the fossils of shallow water organisms, corals and shells that can only live within metres of the surface, stacked in layers from the top of the hole to the bottom. Every one of them had grown in sunlight. Every one of them had then been carried down as the volcano sank beneath them. Coral had been climbing that mountain for something in the order of 30 million years, keeping pace, never quite losing. Ladd put up a small sign beside the borehole. It said that Darwin was right. But look at what else that core said. because nobody was reading it for this. It said that from the sand at the surface to the basalt 1,400 meters down, this island is one continuous mass of carbonate, reef rock, rubble, cemented sand, and the karstified limestone of older sea levels riddled with dissolution cavities. There is no clay layer, no shale, no impermeable stratum anywhere in it. Not at 10 meters, not at 100, not at 1,000. The whole structure is a sponge. Seawater sits inside it and moves inside it, and always has. The thin skin of fresh water people drink from floats on top of that seawater precisely because the rock is porous enough to let both of them occupy the same space. The permeability is not a flaw in this ground. It is what the ground is.
6 years after that drill core came up out of Runit's neighbourhood, a hole was blown in Runit itself. 25 years after that, the hole was filled and capped. And the ground did exactly what 1,400 metres of core had already described. The dome is not failing. The dome is being an accurate demonstration. Somebody looked at an atoll and saw ground. The kind of ground a continent has, the kind you can dig into and close over and walk away from. What was actually there was a 2,000-year-old sand ridge on top of a 30-million-year-old column of porous stone, standing in 4 kilometres of ocean. Concrete cannot fix that, because the concrete was never the part that had to hold. The bottom was. And the highest point on Enewetak Atoll is now that lid. 3 metres of poured concrete standing above an island that averages 2. In a country with no hills, the tallest thing anyone made was a roof over a hole. Meanwhile, 20 kilometres to the south, a few hundred people live on the same atoll and fish the same lagoon. They are there because they asked to be. It was their atoll for 2,000 years before any of this, and they wanted it back. That is the answer to the question in the title, and it is smaller and more stubborn than the dome is. People do not live beside that structure because they are unaware of it, or because they have nowhere else to be. They live there because it is theirs, and because the alternative was a smaller, drier island that was never theirs at all. The Marshall Islands are usually told as a story about what was done to them. That story is true, and it is not small, and nothing in this film is an argument against it. But it is not the oldest thing here, and telling it first tends to leave the impression that this country begins in the middle of the 20th century, that before then there was simply a beach waiting. There was not a beach waiting. There was a working answer to one of the hardest environments people have ever chosen to occupy, and it had been running for 2,000 years. Consider what that answer actually consisted of. It did not consist of building anything permanent, because permanence was not on the table. There is no stone. The sand moves. The shoreline of an atoll islet is not a fixed line. It migrates, sediment stripping off one end during a storm season and accreting onto the other. Nobody here ever had the option of the walled town, the terraced hillside, the cathedral that outlasts the country. The material refused. So the culture put its permanence somewhere else. It put it in navigation, which is knowledge and cannot be washed away. It put it in the breadfruit pit and the taro pit, which are made of compost and get rebuilt by the next generation. It put it in the sennit lashing of a canoe, which is designed to be undone and retied. It put it in matrilineal land rights, where the connection to a piece of ground passes through the mother's line, a claim that survives the physical rearrangement of the ground itself. None of that shows up in a photograph. There are no ruins here. That is not because nothing happened. It is because nothing was built to be a ruin. And this is where the navigator lying flat in the hull stops being a colourful detail and becomes the thesis. He is not looking for land. He has accepted that the land is invisible, too low, too far, too small. What he is doing instead is reading the pattern that land makes in the water around it. He locates a place he cannot see by the way it disturbs something else. That is precisely the correct instinct for this ground. You cannot hold an atoll. You can only read it, where the rain falls and where it does not, where the island is wide enough to keep a lens and where it is not, which reef flat makes sand and which one takes it away, when the swell will cross the road. The people who lived here longest did not try to make this place behave. They learned exactly how it behaves and arranged themselves around that. There is a bird that comes here every year and makes the same calculation. The bristle-thighed curlew nests on the tundra of western Alaska. In late summer, it flies south across open ocean, several thousand kilometers, non-stop, no land beneath it for days, and comes down on the atolls of the tropical Pacific. Then it does something no other shorebird in the world does. It molts its flight feathers all at once, and for several weeks it cannot fly. A shorebird that cannot fly on an island in the middle of the Pacific. That only works in one circumstance. An island with nothing on it that hunts. No rats, no cats, no dogs, no pigs. The curlew's entire annual strategy depends on the existence of atolls that have never been settled. Which is why the bird is now found reliably in the same handful of places the drought kept people out of. It is one of the northern atoll's quiet residents, and the sanctuary drawn around them in 2025 is, without anyone framing it that way, a flightless bird refuge. It crosses the widest ocean on Earth in order to be helpless somewhere safe. And it finds those specks the same way the navigators did, by knowing exactly what it is looking for, in a place where almost nothing is visible. The Marshall Islands are younger than most people assume. The reef is ancient, 30 million years of it, 1,400 meters thick, still growing at the rim. But the dry land, the part with the coconut palms and the villages and the road, came up out of the water around 2,000 years ago. This country is younger than the Roman Empire. Its oldest ground is more recent than the Great Wall. And people arrived within a century or so of the land existing, which is about as close to the beginning of a place as anyone gets. They came to 180 square kilometers of new sand in 2 million square kilometers of ocean, with no rivers, no stone, no soil, and no height. And they stayed. And they are still here, 42,000 of them, on the same atolls, speaking the same language, using the same 4 crops. Perhaps what matters about this place is not the lid on Runit at all. Perhaps what matters is that the lid was built by people who thought the ground would keep it, and that it sits on an island belonging to people who could have told them it would not. The rain still comes and still runs through. The tide still moves inside the rock twice a day.
the way it has since the coral first broke the surface. And on a strip of sand 300 meters wide, with the ocean on one side and the lagoon on the other, someone is still lying flat in the hull of a canoe, feeling for the shape of an island they cannot see. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.